Thank you, Vernon, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'd like to essentially, thank you, present the ongoing research that my colleagues and I at the Kennedy School, at the Belfer Center in particular, have been working on this particular issue. This issue has been with us for a long period of time now. And I think given the headlines and the latest developments, there are a number of angles from which to look at these issues. But I wanted to frame it from the most recent, and that is in the context of last Friday's second intercontinental ballistic missile. Many of my colleagues thought that that term would come into vogue 3 to 5 years from now. And I think with the revision of a lot of these timelines, it gives a sense of urgency of what's happening vis-a-vis this rapid growth of North Korea's ballistic missile as well as nuclear capabilities. So with the heading of the ICBM, in the technical community, there's a lot of debate right now of this whole threshold idea. There are a subgroup of the technical experts saying the second ICBM test, if you evaluate it from the reentry vehicle component, what was caught on this security camera in Hokkaido, that it basically failed, that it disintegrated and shows that the North Koreans aren't quite there yet. But I would encourage the group here to think of the net assessment. And on a net assessment, certainly there are setbacks, but North Korea of late has been making remarkable net forward progress. So specifically with the question of where this North Korean nuclear crisis is headed, I wanted to get into the details here. So the 3 key points here, first is if you look at this second ICBM test, based on its altitude and the distance, the consensus view is that this technology now has the potential capability of reaching the continental United States. Now, a shorthand version of that is the American homeland. North Korea has never posed a direct threat to the American homeland. The traditional threat perception was that the growing North Korean capabilities put U.S. allies, U.S. military personnel, U.S. citizens in the region at risk. But now the notion of an unconstrained North Korean nuclear weapons program, there is no agreement in place. There are no constraints overall in terms of, if you look at the sanctions, the view is that they haven't been successful for the narrow purpose of trying to slow down or halt North Korea's WMD programs. We have now senior U.S. government officials labeling North Korea as a clear and present danger to the American homeland. And that formulation has elevated the priority of North Korea as a threat. But if you look at the various tools, and I'll go into a little more detail, right now there's a big focus on ballistic missile defense. And those various capabilities, while we have had a number of recent tests to try to further develop those capabilities, the operative word is in development. This is a type of technology that is still being further developed. The second point that I wanted to raise is the specific point related to sanctions. There is something that last summer when I was here, had a chance to engage the audience then about the sanctions conundrum. Now, counterintuitive, but in further applying sanctions on the North Korean regime, we're seeing in key instances the North Korean regime developing almost this superbug capability, or drug resistance, if you will, and also an opportunity to innovate on their procurement activities that have led to improvements overall of the procurement capabilities to get the components that they need for further developing their capabilities on the WMD side. Given the current pace of developments, there is no certainty of U.S. military action, but certainly the, I think, way to frame it objectively is that the likelihood of U.S. military action is rising if the current trend lines continue. And the last point, I wanted to go into a bit of detail of how the core countries are dealing with this particular issue, specifically from the angle of how they're framing the North Korean nuclear threat, how they're evaluating it, and how they're seeking to manage it. So to go down a bit of memory lane here, this is a graphic that my colleagues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies put together, looking at the 3 Kim leaders, the reign of the Kim family. The founder, under Kim Il-sung, from 1984 to 1994, we really didn't see much in terms of these type of development activities. Under his son, Kim Jong-il, you're looking at a situation where towards the latter part of his rule, there definitely was more activity. And I think overall view is that Kim Jong-il was adept at using ballistic missile tests and nuclear tests to raise the price, if you will, of the prelude to a negotiation, this idea of a bargain, being bought out, if you will. Now, under the grandson of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un, prolific. And we're talking about different types of technologies on the ballistic missile range, as well as the nuclear tests. And if you look at this last column in 2016 alone, last year, the diversity of that portfolio of ballistic missile capabilities and testing is truly different and a source of a lot of concern. The key takeaway, though, is Kim Jong-un and the 5 years of his rule so far, there's yet to be any overtures about negotiations, any serious ones at least. And with this, there's an increasing view that Kim Jong-un is very focused on nuclear weapons capability. But the qualification here is this intercontinental ballistic missile and a nuclear warhead on top of that. If you look at it from the international relations history, that type of weaponry is really the preserve of the great powers. So for a country of a little over 20 million that is always viewed on the brink of food security issues, and also this young leader of 33, 34 years of age, the idea of this type of regime having the ultimate weapon in international relations is something that has led to the conclusion from a lot of the professionals in Washington and the military, intelligence, and government circles that this is something that it can't be tolerated. It's something that we can't trust the North Korean regime with this type of capability. And that's where I think we see the elevation of the urgency of the North Korean nuclear issue at this particular point in time. Now, the other part of it, if you zero in, the advancements in the technology, it is qualitatively different. This is from February of 2017 and the test of what's called the Pukguksong-2. This is a mobile launcher, and if you look at the tracked capabilities, you get a sense of how this is a capability that gives the North Korean regime strategic surprise. There are very limited roadways in North Korea, so for this type of vehicle to have the tank tracks, the ability to go off-road, if you will, the capability to surprise different countries that are monitoring the situation, this is the premium when it gets to this area of going beyond fixed sites. The second feature is the missile itself. The Pukguksong-2 is classified as an intermediate range, something that could range to Guam. But what is striking here is that this is solid fuel. Liquid fuel is something that Kim Jong-il was noted for in the sense of fueling these type of rockets took time. And knowing when US and other countries' satellites would go overhead, there was something of a production to signal that this was being launched or prepared in a way to ratchet up tensions and get more by way of concessions. But with something like a solid fuel, it really is a very short timeline. You are caught off by surprise, as we were when the Pukguksong-2 was launched. The other feature of this particular test is that this is based on something called the Topol. It's a Soviet-era submarine-launched ballistic missile. It's one way for the North Korean regime to signal that this is proven technology. This isn't experimental. The fact that you had a submarine-based capability brought to land, certainly there are modifications required, but overall there was a surprise. This caught the community by surprise when this happened. With all of these events, though, you have to ground yourself in reality. How did this come about? For the North Korean regime to be able to finance this and actually procure these components as well, you're missing a lot of the pictures, I think, when you see the current focus on the analysis of where the program is at. If we take a step back and look at the macro picture, the evolution of the commercial and trading relationship between the Chinese and the North Koreans is a very important consideration and factor to bring into the analysis. The red line here is inter-Korean trade, and the blue line denotes the China-North Korea trade. And if you look at it, the late 2000s is the inflection point. This is where we see the tremendous growth of that bilateral trade. One of the key things, though, is that in the analysis of North Korea, there has been a predominant focus on the changes inside of North Korea. Is Kim Jong-un affecting economic reform? Is the economic situation improving in North Korea? But a part of the equation that has been missing in terms of the analysis is what the North Korean regime has been doing inside of the Chinese marketplace. And this is where, when you look at the cold trade coming online in the second half of the 2000s, so the regime being able to make that money, amass those funds that later becomes a source of financing for the specialized procurement, you get a sense of how the 1% in North Korea and the population of the regime, this is a period of tremendous prosperity. And I think it's here you have to do the very specialized analysis of the 1% and the 99%. For the 99% in North Korea, the informal markets, the growth of these local markets that are close to the border with China has been a big part of their improved prosperity in a relative sense. But it's the 1% and this very specialized connection to China and the different commercial opportunities there that I think has a very powerful explanatory power overall in terms of the dynamics that's been happening in a number of areas. With a lot of these type of situations, though, to have such a dramatic increase in bilateral trade is something in this shorter period of time is not quote-unquote organic or natural. And a big part here is the political explanation. In October of 2009, then Premier Wen Jiabao led a very senior delegation. In last year's talk at the Asia Society, I went into more detail about that. But the key takeaways there, you're looking at the Communist Party of China essentially inviting the Workers' Party of Korea in an effort to institution build, to build up the party on the North Korean side as a factor of stability for the longer term. Now, on the North Korean piece of this, as I mentioned before, you're looking at the North Korean state trading companies being a core element in the ability for the 1% to enjoy these commercial opportunities on the Chinese side. One way to think of it is North Korea Incorporated, this network, this community of state trading companies that fulfill very explicit purposes for the regime, very specialized purposes. Now, traditionally, they've been there to procure items that the regime needs in terms of shoring up stability, and increasingly over the years to develop operating budget to run some of these bureaucracies. But in the more recent years, we're seeing the use of these type of commercial channels for that type of specialized procurement of dual-use items that go into the ballistic missile or nuclear program. Something that had been the source of speculation became fact in September of 2016. So last fall, we're looking at a situation where the US government then, using cooperative channels with their Chinese counterparts, the Chinese in turn detained CEO in Tandong. So Tandong Hongxiang case is a very important precedent, but through that investigation, we were able to find that there are private Chinese companies that are doing this type of procurement on behalf of North Korean clients. And their ability to charge higher commission fees to essentially be compensated for the elevated risk of doing these transactions is a big part of the improvement of these procurement networks. In a lot of North Korea talks, the question of sources of information is critical. And in this particular type of research, we're able to identify a very specialized group of former North Korean state trading company managers. Now, in a lot of the common literature, they're framed as procurement agents, and they sound like individuals that have this kind of shady kind of characteristic. But inside of China, they're nothing more than expat businessmen. And the opportunity to do business in the open and interact with local private Chinese companies and gain that kind of knowledge of the local marketplace has been significantly beneficial to the North Korean regime. But with this, the North Korean regime, like everyone else, is bound by the equation of profit equals revenue minus costs. And with the running of these state trading companies, before the further spike of the coal trade, it was quite difficult to run and operate these state trading companies. But the coal trade has been something of a game changer for the North Korean regime, and that's something we have to factor in. One of the caveats here is that there's a great deal of focus in the UN Security Council resolutions to go after this coal trade. And if you look at it, the more recent Security Council resolutions are focused on something called sectoral bans, where China in particular is helping to implement these measures where the Chinese side is essentially not purchasing North Korean coal. And the idea is by doing that, you cut off a revenue stream that the regime can use for this further type of specialized procurement. But I would argue that in many instances, it's too little too late. If you look at the volume of the coal trade and the fact that in the late 2000s, the commodity price for coal was spiking at $100 per ton, the North Korean regime was able to amass quite a lot in that time period. And the ability to draw on those funds now to finance proliferation is something that I think requires other policy tools. And I'll go into a little bit of that later on. If we zero in on the China factor, one way to absorb this is that China has been approaching a dual track in parallel fashion dealing with the North Korean issue. One is the party-to-party connection, and that is the highlight of which was the October 2009 high-level delegation with Wen Jiabao leading the equivalent of an interagency group over to Pyongyang and signing these trade agreements and other types of party-to-party agreements. And then the Chinese chairmanship of the six-party talks. Many believe that it is no longer functioning, but on paper it still exists, where the two Koreas, Russia, Japan, the United States, and China were trying to peacefully effect a grand bargain resolution in a peaceful manner of the nuclear issue. Now, if you look at the Chinese activity right now, there is a great deal of commercial activity through the party-to-party interaction with zero linkage to denuclearization. The priority here is the stability of the North Korean regime. And the peak of this type of activity was around the period of the succession, the leadership succession, where we had an ailing Kim Jong-il accelerating the transfer of power to his son. And the Chinese concern about the stability of the North Korean regime, and we see the growth of these party-to-party mechanisms. But the fact that it has zero linkage to denuclearization doesn't mean that the Chinese leadership is not concerned about denuclearization. The view is that they have a dedicated channel through the six-party talks. Key takeaway here, though, is if you're in North Korea's position, you're receiving a lot of benefits in the party-to-party connection with zero linkage to denuclearization. Then the question is, if you're the North Korean regime, why would you go back to the six-party talks? So I think the prioritization of stability in that short-term period unintentionally has this negative consequence of essentially taking the momentum out of the six-party talks and creating this very specialized channel through the party-to-party connection. Now, if you look at the other countries, it's quite scattered, but I draw your attention to where the United States is. And the fact that the United States codifies everything through the lens of denuclearization. No denuclearization activity, no economic development assistance, other benefits along the lines of implementing denuclearization. But it's the relative gap between China and the United States that gives you a sense of the enormous room that the North Korean regime has to maneuver. When you look at these type of activities on the ballistic missile development and nuclear development front, there's almost a kabuki play-like immediate reaction. It's usually this reversion to the Security Council, a statement of condemnation, and usually another Security Council resolution with yet more sanctions. But as that tone of condemnation subsides, you kind of see this type of return to the commercial activities, and particularly the continuity in many instances of the North Korean activities inside of the Chinese marketplace. Now, if we switch to the third point here of how the countries have been dealing with the situation, one way to frame it is from the perspective of the actual name of the Trump administration's North Korea policy. In the prelude to the summit between President Xi Jinping and President Trump in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, the U.S. administration announced the North Korea policy, and it's called maximum pressure and engagement. Right now, we're seeing statements under both headings that give a sense of lack of coordination even within the administration. Most recently, we had Secretary of State Tillerson talk about the opportunity to engage the North Koreans in negotiations, but with the condition that North Korea commit to denuclearization. But we're seeing a lot more under the maximum pressure. And here, the notion of the increasing potential of the use of military force if North Korea continues on its development pace. If you plot it along the lines of maximum pressure and engagement, China is, I think, very much in that category of the commercial engagement, this idea of the longer-term play of building up the Workers' Party of Korea as a partner and as an institution to shore up longer-term stability. But with that, certainly China has signed on for the more recent sectoral bans, but there are question marks in terms of implementation. With a lot of the recent technology, there are very small research groups that are able to use this technology to track coal freighters going back and forth between North Korean ports and Chinese ports. And the initial assessment is that a lot of that activity is still going on in spite of the more recent sectoral bans. Now, if you look at the other countries, for a country like Russia, there are ongoing commercial activities related largely to North Korean labor inside of Russia, and broader examples of gasoline and refined petroleum type of trade whenever there is a curtailment in the China-North Korea dynamic. But in terms of the maximum pressure component, clearly Russia is on the lower edge of that as well. Oh, perhaps it's a North Korean hack of the presentation. But let me summarize with that particular one, the sense of the relative distance as well between where the United States is, where it's predominantly in the maximum pressure category and less on the engagement side. So you're looking at a situation where, yet again, the gap persists. It's going to seem like deja vu here. But with the last slide, the ongoing focus and prioritization of maximum pressure is curating something of a polarization. Now, with this, the question of where two key countries, the allies of the United States, are, is a big focus of attention as well. South Korea recently had a change of government, so now we have a progressive government in South Korea under Moon Jae-in. The concern during the election cycle was that President Moon, being a part of the progressive group, as he increasingly had a good chance of winning the Blue House, that he would reintroduce Sunshine Policy, this economic engagement of North Korea. That hasn't fully come to fruition, but there are ongoing efforts from the South Korean side to try to engage the North Koreans. Those efforts have met with a lot of silence on the North Korean piece. But if you look at the Japanese side of things, there is an interesting closeness between the United States and Japan that if you think of the saying, don't let a good crisis go to waste, the notion of the common threat perception is key here. I think the Japanese and the United States and the international community are perhaps the only two countries who view North Korea the exact same way, which is as an existential threat. Existential in the sense that Japan for many years now has been the focus of a growing North Korean missile, a proven North Korean missile capability. With the intercontinental ballistic missile capability now ranging and threatening the United States, there is that threat perception that is quite common. Now, South Korea has also been living under the threat of North Korean force, but it's different. And here you're looking at the long-range artillery that more or less holds Seoul hostage. One point I'd end up here and just open up to Q&A and broader discussion. If you look at how the North Korean calculus is changing over time, there are a number of features to highlight, but the most important is the anticipation from the North Korean side as they continue down this path of a nuclearized ICBM, that the probability of military action from the United States grows. So rather than being caught off guard by that or having their capabilities somehow reduced by this increasing specter of US military action, over the years we've seen a North Korean movement of their ballistic missile and nuclear testing facilities and storage facilities close to the border with China. So if there is a US military strike, we're looking at a situation where you'd have the world's two largest militaries in close proximity essentially operating. And the hope, I think, from the North Korean side, that that type of calculus would lead to a further consideration from the US side of actually carrying out a US military action. But the factor to keep in mind in the back of your minds as you look at this unfolding situation, again, is what I started out with, which is North Korean nuclear ICBMs and the march towards that and the net forward progress, putting the the American homeland within that type of range and at risk. And that's a part of the dynamic that's different. This is an element that if you look at the US focus and some of the statements that have been coming out, this is, I think, taken a lot of officials by surprise. Not in that they weren't anticipating this, but the fact that the North Koreans are making this kind of progress so quickly. So on that note, let me open it up to some questions and some discussion.
Political relationship with China. Kim has not visited China since he came into office, I don't believe. And much is made of the fact that there's no direct contact between the two.
Sure. Sure. So the question about the personal dynamics between the Chinese and North Korean leaders, I don't think it is an underestimation to say that there's mutual animosity between the two leaders. But I don't think that is a factor that derails away from Chinese focus on rebuilding the Workers' Party of Korea. Something that comes out in meetings with Chinese colleagues, there is no love lost for the Kim family. And I think the sense of North Korea creating all of these headaches for the Chinese leadership is something that they endure, but keeping a focus on a time when there isn't a Kim family member in rule of North Korea, to have a party mechanism is surely a more durable way to go about it. So I think that prioritization leads to a certain type of discipline on the Chinese side, that irrespective of any type of working relationship between the two leaders, the actual party-to-party mechanism is still active. Right now, the Chinese ambassador to Pyongyang technically isn't a foreign ministry person. That individual is from the International Liaison Department of the Communist Party of China. That phrase is really an echo from the Cold War period. So it gives you a sense of a very different type of relationship that the party maintains with their North Korean counterparts. Yes?
Well, first, thank you very much indeed for sharing this insightful analysis with us. I'd like to ask a question on the end game. There is no doubt that the North Koreans are taking leave from Chairman Mao's book, when Communist China in the beginning was almost at war with Russia, which was, of course, a nuclear power at the time before China developed the first atomic bomb. And the mantra at the time was China would rather have the atomic bomb rather than sacrificing, in China's expression, the trousers. And a lot of people don't even have trousers. They were so poor. So the Chinese expression was to rather have the Herzi, which is the nuclear, rather than the Kuzi, which is the trousers. Now, this is, it informs this kind of existential threat the regime is facing. So that's why North Korea is hell-bound in trying to get this bomb and the delivery systems. Now, so what's the end game? That the assessment seems that they are able to develop this ICBM capability probably in the beginning of next year. Indeed, even President Trump said that he's prepared to talk directly to Kim, and perhaps trying to broker a kind of peace, non-aggression treaty, of course, coupled with verifiable de-escalation. To what extent do you think this is feasible? Because otherwise, the military option would be very, very dangerous, leaving aside the ICBM's capability. Don't forget that Seoul, the capital of South Korea, is so close to North Korea, and they have hundreds and thousands of heavy artillery, which can devastate Seoul, in a matter of days. So, and apart from the fact of drawing all the major powers into the conflict. So, what's the end game?
For North Korea, the end game has a name. It's called Pyeongjin. It's the idea of parallel development of a minimal nuclear deterrent, and then the focusing on the development and the improvement of the overall economy. I think, particularly in policy analysis circles in China, there's enormous sympathy and this view that sounds familiar, as you're pointing out. Having a minimal nuclear deterrent means the North Korean regime, the calculation that they would avoid a costly arms race, and frankly, I think the assessment of North Korea is very limited, very finite resources. But to have a minimal nuclear deterrent from a strategic analysis standpoint, the community there views it as very logical and something to be expected. But conceptually, that's the part very difficult for those in leadership positions in Washington to absorb that. While I think in Northeast Asia, there's a view that Kim Jong-un is not suicidal, who is going to take that risk in U.S. policy circles in Washington of, on their watch, having a nuclear ICBM North Korea, and on top of that, this penultimate weapon, more or less in the hands of a young leader who is all of 33, 34 years old. So that's a part where we're all anticipating how are we going to get over that hump. And as we go farther up that mountain, the probability of military action rises. Now, there's always the possibility of some sort of unexpected breakthrough on the diplomatic side. No one kind of sees where it might come from. There is discussion of perhaps there's a way to broker a freeze with the North Koreans. But from the analysis of Pyeongjin, what that leads to is negotiations, but not denuclearization negotiations. That leads to nuclear arms control negotiations, where you could see potentially North Korean regime willing to give up the production facilities, but retain that minimal nuclear deterrent, so a small arsenal of nuclear ICBMs. This is where I think the analysis is hitting reality very quickly, and we're seeing this unfold in real time. Now, if we just take the example of what happened last month, in the month of July, we've had 2 ICBM tests. So the pace of it, North Korea looks like they're doing these type of ballistic missile developments every 2 weeks. That pace is, I think, from the policy analysis and policy response community, leading to catching up. This is a part of the sense of concern that is growing very, very quickly in the midst of all this.
Thank you. Do we know where North Korea is continuing to source the technology, and just how have they been able to accelerate the pace of development so much recently?
Absolutely. The traditional analysis of countries that have developed nuclear weapons, if you look at the common denominators, they all developed a very large military-industrial complex. In the case of North Korea, earlier on, they did as well. The Yongbyon nuclear facility became the basis of essentially the focus of the plutonium side of things. And then over time, we've seen more of this kind of Soviet-era technology for their missiles. The production and assembly lines for the missiles, I think, is now accepted as an internal and indigenous North Korean capability. But when it comes to the top part of these missiles and the electronics, the guidance, and these things, we actually know through UN Security Council, the panel of experts, as well as an instance in April of 2013, when at that time North Korea was very careful to frame this as a satellite, a space program. There was an explosion a few seconds after launch of what essentially is a ballistic missile just west of South Korea. The South Korean Navy went out, salvaged the parts, they did the investigation, and they verified that. The bottom half of the missile, the rocket motor, the different components could be traced back to this kind of Soviet lineage. But when they went farther up the missile, when it came to the guidance and other components, these things were traced back to Western Europe, the United States, to Japan. So the question of how North Korea, and these are sanctioned items or on control lists, export control lists, how the North Koreans got a hold of that is this part of the sanctions puzzle as well. I think the growing view is that the North Korean ability to do their procurement inside of the Chinese marketplace with a private Chinese company, either being able to procure some of these items directly from foreign companies that are producing these items inside of China, or using these private Chinese companies to procure in the global marketplace, is something that is different. Before, it's not to say North Korea didn't do procurement before, it's the way they did it before. I think the notion of North Korean officials going on these business trips to the Middle East or other parts of Eastern Europe, procuring the item and coming back was more of the pattern of behavior. But being late to globalization and having access to these type of business practices has, I think, boosted that type of procurement.
Another question.
How would you assess America's approach to the issue in the last 6 months? And what are your predictions in terms of how America and China are going to engage on the issue in the near term?
The Chinese piece is initially the foundation of this new administration's approach dealing with North Korea. And we saw that come about in the Mar-a-Lago summit. After that, you saw President Trump more or less link the two. So, for China's help in reining in North Korea, there would be a good trade deal, some aspect of linking security and trade, something that we actually haven't seen before in that very explicit manner. Very recently, President Trump tweeted out the disappointment that China had not delivered. And now there is growing focus on what's called secondary sanctions. These are essentially sanctions targeting Chinese companies, entities, banks that are known to be doing business with these designated North Korean officials engaged in this type of activity. But I think the prognosis going forward, China's been very consistent in their statements, saying that it's not China's problem and it's not China's responsibility, that the nuclear crisis between the nuclear issue is between the United States and North Korea. And China has been very consistent in saying that they would support any diplomatic venue. They would be supportive in a way that few countries could. But if you look again at how Pyongyang is playing out, this North Korean game plan, the negotiation part comes later on after full acquisition of a nuclear ICBM capability. So that's the part where the gap, how we're going to bridge that gap, that's where we're all holding our breath. Because in that period of that gap, the probability and the likelihood of military action rises. Maybe a question in the back, if we could.
Get you in there.
Going off of that question, do you think China has the leverage that the Trump administration seems to think it has on North Korea?
If the question is about the trade leverage, the statistics all show that, and that's been well documented. But from a Chinese calculation, they're not going to cut off the trade. They're not going to do things that would be the tipping point of a collapsed regime and a failed state on their border. I think as China's rising in economic and military capabilities, the sense among Chinese leaders that they have more tools that they can apply to this very complex situation gives a sense of confidence still as the stakes are getting higher. But what the Chinese authorities have been doing, and I don't think this has been fully detected, the Chinese are concerned about the North Koreans using these commercial channels. And the vast majority of these commercial channels are used for benign activities of low-level consumer products and things along those lines. It's a smaller percentage that's used for the illicit trade of procuring specialized items. The Chinese have been doing something that I call sanitizing their trade. They've been trying to sanitize their trade with the North Koreans. We know this through documents. In 2013, a group of Chinese ministries issued something called Technical Bulletin 59. And this 236-page report documented the items, photos, basically saying that Chinese nationals are prohibited from selling these items to North Koreans, that it would be a criminal activity under Chinese law. But after 2013, the North Koreans did more capable ballistic missile and nuclear tests. So one way to interpret it is that this effort failed. It's not to say that we should give up or somehow throw in the towel. And the Chinese, I think, are still trying to improve upon those capabilities. But you're going up against some fairly sophisticated business networks where a North Korean client engaging with a private Chinese company in a local market and a commercial hub in China, and that private Chinese company usually having connections with local corrupt party officials, are able to create these commercial channels that have the added benefit of hiding in the open. With the incredible volume of trade and commercial activity inside of the Chinese marketplace, by doing it in the open, you actually get strategic advantage of blending in. It's harder to detect. So I think there is more room for the Chinese law enforcement tools and other domestic policy tools to be explored, and that's separate from the sanctions approach. Not to say that sanctions should be abandoned. There are some benefits there as well. But now is the time to fully and robustly engage these type of domestic policy tools on the Chinese side.
Back, different table.
Thank you. What is your assessment, I guess it's a two-part question, of how Kim Jong-un is controlling the country compared with the party? I mean, we can see that he's executed his brother and his uncle, and then they say things about executing people with anti-aircraft missiles and stuff like that, or guns or whatever it was. So he's obviously got some kind of battle there. So how much is he in control? And then how much is the party? And even if he wasn't in control, would the party be the same? And would he be able to take over? And would anything change?
When we first saw even a photo of Kim Jong-un when he was first unveiled as the new leader, everyone wrote him off as not lasting long. Or if he was around, just as a symbolic figurehead, and his uncle Chang Song-taek and his aunt, younger sister of Kim Jong-il, would essentially be the regents, and they would rule the country through the authority of the Kim family name. All of these different theories were debunked because with the execution of Uncle Chang and his aunt is nowhere to be seen, and then other potential powerful generals from his father period, all of them have been removed in some fashion. Kim Jong-un is now his own leader. He is cocooned by his own generals. One of the things about doing this kind of North Korea incorporated and looking at the business activities of the North Korean regime, you get a sense of how under Kim Jong-il, the idea that he was an iron-fisted ruler, certainly there were examples of that. But what's missed is almost a business management style, where in giving lucrative mining and other types of commercial concessions to powerful generals, he was able to co-opt them into the system that was the North Korean regime at that time. If you look at how the cocooning of Kim Jong-un by his own generals takes place, he essentially takes these commercial concessions away from his father's generals and gives it to his generals. So there is something of this symbiotic relationship that grows, and you have individuals who are essentially stakeholders in the current regime and the current order. So when you look at it from the notion of, is he doing these things out of weakness or is he doing it out of strength? I am more in the camp of doing it now out of strength, and he's consolidated his power. He faces a number of external challenges, but the way that he has been able to maneuver around these difficulties and end in the position that he is right now, he still is essentially controlling very well-resourced and powerful internal security organizations that protect him. And these security organizations are more powerful than the military. They're better resourced. They're the type of organizations that spy on the people, the 99%. They spy on the 1%. They spy on each other, and they spy on the military. So when you come to this kind of surveillance state, it is the ultimate in terms of control. And then you introduce technology to that, and you're seeing capability enforcement level that's even higher.
So many questions.
talking about potential military action, is it really a realistic and pragmatic and efficient option for the U.S. considering the dynamics and the potential reaction, or not potential, the definitive reactions from China and possibly the Russia? So does the U.S. really have any real meaningful alternatives on this very specific relationship with North Korea?
I don't think any of the military leaders, and right now in this administration in the United States, there are a lot of former generals. None of those professional military people take for granted the costs associated with this. But on a net assessment basis, because of this growing threat from this small regime, in the grand scheme of things, again, a country of a little over 20 million people, being able to have the capability of a nuclear ICBM, that's a part where you even had Secretary Mattis talk about how if there is military action, it would be tragic, the consequences of that. I think it's a sense of the rapid pace of the development, but also this notion that there have been no reciprocity from the North Korean side in earlier efforts to have some kind of dialogue going. We put, I think, a lot of emphasis in terms of the China factor, but that was reflection of reality as well. Early on in this administration in the United States, there was a great deal of focus on trying to convince the Chinese to do more. And there was a sense of confidence coming out of Mar-a-Lago as well that Xi Jinping was handling the issue. So about 100 days passes by in the sense, well, clearly the successive North Korean tests are showing otherwise. I think that period of 100 days was, in reflection, will be viewed as a period of perhaps maybe false confidence or too confident. But right now we're in a position where, again, based on this trend line of where North Korea is headed, there are few policy tools other than the military one that could be appropriate for that particular development, which makes this a very destabilizing and very concerning situation right now.
Just before you speak, I mean, 100 days from a Chinese perspective is a very short period of time. I mean, the president may be thinking of 300 days, or I mean, but anyway, your question.
Yeah, given that Mr. Kim spent probably his teenage years in speaks probably Swiss German, I'm wondering whether we should not introduce a third group of countries. All of these countries, these countries that we see here, are either on one side or the other. Should there be a neutral country helping to mediate between these groups? Switzerland has done this many times in its history and is known as a neutral power to help broker conversations between whether it's the US and Iran or other countries. Why is this not something that one is to pursue?
I think there were efforts in the past, but it, I think, goes back to the sense of existential threat. When North Korea was at a lower level of nuclear development, the opportunity for other countries to use diplomatic means to try to broker a big peaceful agreement, we saw a lot of activity. But given the advanced state of North Korea's program right now, this is where I think the sense of either North Korea as an opening part of a negotiation announces denuclearization. And this is a part of Secretary Tillerson's notion of an overture of some kind of negotiation or engagement that North Korea would commit to denuclearization first. That precondition, as some people view it, is seen as something that the North Korean won't reciprocate in terms of coming to negotiating table, which negates the opportunity for neutral countries to play a role. I think if there is an avenue for neutral countries to have that type of diplomatic contribution, it's probably in coordination with China, because China is so committed to some kind of diplomatic breakthrough as well. And South Korea as well, increasingly. But if you look at the hierarchy of interests, this nuclear ICBM threatening the American homeland, it is so far high above the other ones that how we shrink that gap is a priority, but we're not seeing that gap reduced in any fashion.
What is your most realistic and most dramatic scenarios going forward?
I thought this was dramatic enough. That's a very high bar. I think what's realistic is North Korea will continue with its pace of development. There is something within psychology called hedonistic assimilation. As you get more comfortable with luxury items, it's harder and harder to enjoy luxury items. I think right now we're seeing a type of North Korean development that the concern subsides. It becomes background noise very quickly. Before, and working on this issue for a number of years, if North Korea did a long-range ballistic missile test, the concern would last for months. Now it's barely lasting a week. And so I think there is an absorption of the level of concern, and that's, I think, a part of human nature. We grow accustomed to it, and for some, it's a factor of resilience. It's hard to move forward and carry on everyday life if these type of developments create this kind of incapacitating fear. But the part that could become more dramatic is an accident, a miscalculation. Up till now, the North Korean ballistic missile testing has been higher rather than longer. So the altitude, their apogee has been very high. And some denote that as an effort to test the re-entry capability. So if you look at the different phases, have a delivery system, and then for the nuclear warhead, as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, it has a heat shield, a re-entry vehicle, and then the targeting aspect. North Korea still is in the development phase of that and the testing phase of that. But right now, if you look at the range of these missiles, they are increasing. The most recent one was just off the coast of territorial Japan, right? So within the range of security camera being able to see the splash, as many people saw at nighttime. So the dramatic component is an accident that in this heightened military situation, we know from a fact from the press reports that whenever these tests happen, they're tracked immediately by the militaries in the region, particularly the United States and naval capabilities. So if there is a view that it's crossing a certain line, then there will be an attempt to intercept. But if there is a malfunction from the North Korean side, how would we know? So the intention of actually trying to target a military base in Japan from an accident, we won't be able to distinguish. So the triggering of an actual kinetic event in the name of self-defense, that's the area of escalation that becomes very worrying.
So I want to ask about North Korea and sort of proliferation coming from North Korea. So one of the worries after the Pakistani sort of nuclear test in the 1990s was that the Pakistani sort of experimental technology sort of just began proliferating to a lot of other places like North Korea. So do you think there's a chance, it is a worry at this stage that North Korea would sort of attempt to sort of try and export this sort of its experiential knowledge and sort of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technology to other countries? And more importantly, do you think other countries will be sort of tempted to sort of follow the North Korean model now that when North Korea has developed a nuclear weapon, it looks like the U.S. is much less likely to intervene in sort of its affairs?
So it's documented North Korea did sell ballistic missile capability to Iran. And the North Koreans did assist the Assad regime in what looks like about the mid-2000 period of building a nuclear reactor. In September 2007, even before there was any substantial construction, the Israelis conducted an air surgical strike and destroyed that facility. And the working assumption with these type of activities was that it was a revenue generator for the regime. But I would contend with the coal trade coming online, that is a much more reliable and more lucrative source of revenue for the regime. And it's not to say that suddenly they feel selling weapons is morally hazardous and they want to get out of that business. It's just the coal trade, having clients right across the border, and the ability to do joint development as well. One of the stories that really hasn't hit the surface is how the heck did the North Koreans develop their mines? We've known since Japanese colonial period that the northern part of the Korean Peninsula was rich in mineral resources. The assessment was always it was too prohibitively expensive to extract. And so no one really took it out of the ground. If you look at it, a big part of the development story is Chinese provincial state-owned enterprise in the mining sector using Chinese public funds, literally sinking it in the ground in these North Korean mines, extracting the coal, selling it on the Chinese side, and privatizing the profits. That's a definition of a good racket. And a lot of people in that syndicate made a lot of money on both sides. So when you look at the coal trade, and there is something of a dip right now, But there are other factors that play as well. There's an economic downturn in the Dongbei area in Yanbian as well. So you have to factor that in as well. And those, I think, have a larger explanatory impact in the situation rather than Chinese leadership clamping down, and hence we're seeing a decline in this type of activity. But the main part of it, though, is the 1%, the North Korean regime elites, the uber elites, if you will, living in the commercial hubs for years on end in China and Southeast Asia. We didn't see that before. So the notion of doing regular business, selling things and making money as well as procuring items, it's much more sophisticated than it has been in the past.
Okay. Sir, you want to share? Yeah. With the microphone.
Well, John, it's been interesting to see you studying one issue for more than 20 years. China definitely is a stakeholder in the whole issue. But China is saying that the key is in the US part, not in the Chinese part. What China can help, I think she is trying to do, is to broker a deal so that the two sides can talk directly. And it's not in the popular media, but it's not a secret either. The offer on the table is that for the US and South Korea to stop their military drill and the North to stop their testing, both of nuclear and the missile. But the US didn't buy it. You want a full commitment to denuclearize, which the North Korea, as you said, would not accept. Now, first, is this the real offer on the table? And why is it unacceptable for the US as a starter?
So first off, the offer has been on the table, particularly pronounced with the new government in Seoul, the Moon Jae-in administration. I think the consensus view in Washington, though, this is an attempt to create a wedge between the United States and their South Korean ally. And on that assessment alone, it's not treated seriously. So you don't even get into the further considerations. But because it's a freeze, that's seen as too little given how far advanced the North Korean threat is. Some argue, well, we need to start with something. Then freeze can be a basis, maybe extending the freeze and other opportunities of diplomatic tools brought to bear on the situation. But unless there's a big breakthrough of something that would minimize and potentially negate peacefully, and hopefully the view now is that Kim Jong-un will, quote unquote, come to his senses. There's a lot of focus on that right now. And so unfortunately, there isn't that diplomatic space in the Washington calculation. Freezes and other things worked in the past because North Korea's nuclear weapons program was at a much lower level of development. You have 5 North Korean nuclear tests. We're all anticipating a 6th at some point. The first one was considered a dud. The technical community believes that because it was below 1 kiloton yield, it wasn't technically a chain reaction, it wasn't a nuclear test. They've done 4 after that, and the 5th one was deemed to be on an explosive yield category where people are nodding their head as they've made significant progress in that area. They still have to miniaturize a nuclear warhead, put it on a payload that would be deliverable. But as I was mentioning, this is a net assessment of setbacks, yes, but on a net assessment, they're making forward progress.
Well, thank you very much indeed.